Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. My name is James Frankel. I'm going to be speaking to you a little bit about my experiences coming to Islam. I'm speaking to you now from Honolulu, Hawaii, and it is September 2011. I'm sorry, 2010. Getting ahead of us. I am a professor of comparative religion, and I teach classes in Islam also at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And I've lived in Hawaii now for just over 2 years, and just entering my third year. And some brothers asked me if I could speak about my experiences, so hopefully, inshallah, I can do this today, and if this is helpful to anybody, may Allah give us all hidayah. As I said, I came to Hawaii 2 years ago. Before that, I lived in New York City. I was born and raised in New York City, born in 1969, and grew up in Manhattan and part of the time in Brooklyn, another few years of my life. For the most part, had a very happy family life. My parents raised me not with any particular religion, but I think with basic set of moral values. Actually, by heritage, my background is Jewish, but I grew up in a very secular household, and there wasn't a lot of religious practice. The only connection I really had to any kind of traditional religion was from my father's side, my grandmother, my father's mother, who was a practicing Jew. And, it's from her that I learned a few things, Bible stories, stories of the prophets. And for a brief period, my parents actually attempted to send me to a Hebrew school to learn more, but I was not very comfortable there, and actually got kicked out for asking too many questions. So this is probably my character, and it has brought me, I should say, to where I am today. As a professor and as a Muslim, I continue to ask a lot of questions. So I grew up in this way, without any real religious foundation, and this continued through my life into my late teens, and I was actually at the age of 13. I had two experiences that are worth mentioning. One, I read the Communist Manifesto of Karl Marx and decided that I was a communist at age 13. I thought the values were sound, and I thought the philosophy was potentially beneficial to people. Also at that time, I suppose this might be one of the earliest exposures to Islam that I can remember. My best friend at that time was from Pakistan. I went to an international school, so I had friends from all over the world. I had a Pakistani friend who gave me a copy of the Quran and thought that it would be, he wanted me to read it. He said, "I don't want you to go to hell." And of course, at that time in my life, thoughts of hell or heaven were not really in my consciousness. And I think I took the book and put it on my shelf, and there it stayed for many years without being opened. A couple of years later, I think I became quite disillusioned as I learned more about the way that communism was actually practiced in many countries in the world. And so I gave up that philosophy as well. And it really wasn't until I entered university that I began to ask the questions that would lead me directly onto this path. I think as a child I was always thoughtful and always wondered about the meaning of life, and those basic questions of why we're here and where we're going, why we suffer. All of those things were always present in my mind even as a child. But as I got older and when I went to university, I focused a lot more on my studies until I had a particular experience. You remember the grandmother that I mentioned before? When I was in university, I was living in Washington, D.C., and I got a phone call from my cousin who was going to school in Maryland. And it was a surprise visit from my grandparents and my aunt and another cousin, and they took me out for dinner. And I spent the evening basically just talking to my grandmother. I told her about my plans to start studying Chinese, which I was doing at the time. I told her about my plans to move back to New York, to transfer to Columbia University. And it was almost as if I saw her and she was giving me her blessing on all of these various decisions that I was making in my life as a young adult. At the end of the evening, I was walking her to her car, and in the parking lot of this restaurant, she turned her ankle and she tripped. And I asked her, "Grandma, are you okay?" And she said, "Don't worry about me. Just worry about yourself." Okay, I thought. And then I continued to walk with her to the car. I opened the door. She got in. I kissed her goodnight. And I said, "Well, I guess the next time I'll see you will be for Thanksgiving when I come back to New York." And she said to me, "God willing." And okay, I didn't think much of it at the time. I closed the door and off they drove. My cousin took me back to my dormitory, and I went to bed. And early the next morning, I got a phone call, and it was my cousin. And I asked him why he was calling so early. And he said, there was no other way to say it. He said, "Grandma died." I said, "Really?" I thought he was joking, maybe. I said, "What are you talking about?" And he explained that she had a heart attack in her sleep. And of course, her final words to me, were echoing in my ears. I said, "I'll see you soon." And she said, "God willing." And I said, "Are you okay?" And she said, "Take care of yourself." So to this day, it was an unexpected visit, and of course an unexpected departure for her. And to this day, I can only wonder, about the meaning of that encounter with my grandmother, who, of course, as I said, was my only link to traditional religion. I went back to New York for the funeral, and it was a traditional Jewish funeral. And the rabbi who was giving the eulogy spoke about my grandmother and said, "Sarah was a rare treasure," he said. "She was like a jewel, and now God has taken this treasure back to him." I said, "Okay." That's what rabbis would say. When the rabbi came to my grandfather's house to pay his respects, I wanted to ask him some questions. I wanted to ask him questions about certain practices that are practiced in a Jewish home at the time of someone's death. And he told me, "Don't worry about those things." He said, "That's just tradition." I said, "Okay, then how about this? In your sermon, you said that my grandmother, I don't know how well you knew her, but you said that she was taken by God. So where is she? And for that matter, where will I go? Where will you go? Where do any of us go? And why are we here?" And all of those questions that well up in the human heart. And the rabbi, I remember very clearly, he looked at his watch and he said, "I have to go." And I don't think that he realized how angry that made me. And I also don't think that he realized at that time that he set me on a course that would lead me to where I am today. Because I became very interested in those questions.